a webinar sponsored by the National Sea Grant Law Center. People will continue to join us, but I want to honor your time and get started promptly because we do have a lot to cover today. My name is Gina Weatherup. I am with Chantilly Mediation and Facilitation. So my role here today is to facilitate your experience in this workshop. As we get started, I want to first acknowledge that there are many things happening today all across the country that might be making things a little bit more difficult than usual for folks to concentrate. So with that in mind, and on behalf of the National Sea Grant Law Center, I first want to just thank everyone for choosing to join us here today and be present for this time together to focus on the issues we face when we're looking at seaweed as a food and keeping food safe, and what the current situation is for seaweed regulations with a federal focus. I'm working with Brian Tarallo of Lizard Brain Solutions and Zach Klein with the National Sea Grant Law Center to try to make things easy for you in this online workshop. So if you have any issues, you can chat directly with Brian or Zach in the Zoom chat box, or if you forget their names, don't worry about it. Ask a question in the chat to everyone, and they will be keeping an eye on that to be able to come and help you out. If you are joining Zoom by phone and you're having any issues, you can come off of mute to ask a question. And if you're joining by phone, it is *6 to mute and unmute yourself. I'm also going to borrow a line that my friend Brian often says. When we do online facilitation, we approach things with a sense of wonder, as in, I wonder what will break today. So if something breaks, our curiosity is satisfied. And if nothing breaks, then we will have a very smooth workshop. At this time, I'd like to welcome our host, Stephanie Otts, Director of the National Sea Grant Law Center, to tell us a little more about what we're doing today.
Great. Thanks, Gina, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited about the enthusiasm for this workshop, and I just wanted to provide a little bit of information about background for this overall project. We received funding. The National Sea Grant Law Center, in partnership with Connecticut Sea Grant, received funding from the National Sea Grant College Program for a 2-year project that is designed to facilitate conversations among state agency personnel who are responsible for managing or regulating seaweed, aquaculture, in order to hopefully help to identify some policy consensus as to the preferred approaches that the states wish to take in partnership with the federal government in regulating the sale of seaweed in its whole form as food. So for our work at this time, we're not thinking about seaweed as livestock feed or for something else. There are 3 components to this project. There's the legal research to identify and assess potential models. And so attorneys at the National Sea Grant Law Center have been working on that for some time. We will be convening a collaborative learning workshop. Unfortunately, we had hoped that it would be in the fall of this year, but COVID has changed the timeline a little bit. So we're now planning sometime in January, and it'll probably be virtual. That will be invitation only and limited to state personnel, state agency personnel, and federal partners and some Sea Grant collaborators. This idea of the workshop today, this webinar series, is to gather some input for that process moving forward, because we know we can't have as many who might be interested to participate in the workshop itself. And then the outcome of that workshop will hopefully be some sort of model law, regulation, or guidance document that can help guide the states as they implement their programs. And with that, next slide. And so welcome to the 2020 webinar series. As I mentioned, it's an opportunity for us and our partners to build foundational base of knowledge and gather input from a broad range of stakeholders to inform workshop discussions and development of a model. Our schedule is obviously today is the first one focused on federal considerations. September 23rd will be another webinar focused on state efforts, and then the last one will be focusing on some stories and being shared by industry members about their barriers and challenges. And so I just want to mention that if you hear from colleagues that they had trouble logging in, we had reached our capacity and we have a wait list for this. And so we noticed that some people were signing in that hadn't registered. And so we've been trying to manage that moving forward. And that's also why it's important for you to rename yourself for what it matches the registration, because we will be using the list to communicate about future efforts, but to share the recording from today and other things as well. So just a little bit of housekeeping there, but welcome, and we're really pleased to see everyone here.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, we were very happy to see such a big interest in this topic. And for that reason, as I take a moment to walk through the agenda, I want to highlight exactly what we'll be doing in a little bit to try to make this interactive. Even though we have such a large group, people are still joining us now. We're at 76 participants. We had over 100 registrants. So to start, we were talking about our purpose. We'll review the agenda. We are going to navigate over to that other software in just a moment. Don't worry about it just yet. It's called Mural. And we'll use that later in the workshop, primarily for our small group discussions. In this first hour, we will have two presentations. Nancy Balcom will speak about the guidance for U.S. domestic seaweed, why is it needed? And then we'll have Manny Hignott with the FDA speak about FSMA preventive controls. Now, he has so much to share, and we expected the interest to be so high that there will be not one, but two opportunities to ask some questions of Manny and his colleagues at the FDA. We will take a break, just a brief 5-minute respite from staring at the screen, hopefully right at 3 p.m. Central. And then we'll have our final presentation about the USDA regulation of seaweed by Kathy Janessi with the National Sea Grant Law Center. Finally, we're going to break out into small group discussions, and we'll give plenty of directions at that time, about 3:20 p.m. Central Time, to be able to gather our knowledge in the room and have you all help out the folks at the National Sea Grant Law Center as they move forward in this important work. So at this time, I'm going to change the screen that you'll be seeing so that you can just look at the mural that we'll be looking at in just a moment. What we want to do is take a moment to give you an opportunity to interact a little bit. You can stay on mute, but you're going to start introducing yourself within Mural. So we will share this link in the chat. And I'm just going to ask you, if we were sitting in a room together, you would have taken a seat at a table, you would have introduced yourself to your colleagues, we would be chit-chatting. So let's take a moment to grab a seat in Mural. You will introduce yourself by double-clicking to create a sticky note and putting down your name, which you will hopefully spell correctly. And you can say something about your role. And if you do it correctly, you won't type over yourself as I just did. So at this point in time, I am going to stop the screen share and invite everyone to navigate in an internet browser. Chrome or Firefox are preferable for Mural. And I see people starting to come over. Brian, do we have that link to share in the Zoom chat?
We do. Let me go ahead and share it.
Thank you.
Okay, you should be able to click on that now.
Great. I see lots of people joining us in the Mural. Thank you so much. It's a little bit experimental. Mural tends to be new for a lot of people, but it's becoming a more popular software here. So one quick tip is to put your cursor down at the bottom of the screen where there is a line. You'll see me with a photo and everyone else with little images of animals. And when you hover over yourself, which is the little circle animal on the leftmost side of the screen, you can hide cursors. And when you hide cursors, it becomes a much friendlier space to play in. And thank you, Brian, for introducing yourself. And I see some other brave folks starting to do so. So again, you're just going to double click to create a sticky. and then type in your name. And if you'd like, you can also share your role or the agency you're joining us from. We're just going to spend a few minutes in Mural to give people an opportunity to introduce themselves. I see lots of people playing around with their sticky colors, and I love that. You can even change the shape if anybody wants to get fancy. You can make your shape a circle. And Melissa, I'm just going to resize your sticky note here. And Raphael as well. There we go. We have so many people on the line. I love seeing the enthusiasm of trying different things. We do need to ask you to try to make your sticky notes a little bit smaller so that we can fit all 80 participants, hopefully, saying hello to each other as we metaphorically take that seat around the mural table. And you'll notice if you do resize yourself, the text will resize automatically. So for those of us who are using the smaller text, you can simply zoom close in and read over everyone who's joining us. I see Pete and Brianna and Madeline and Carrie and Jacqueline and Caird. Lots of folks saying hello. Excellent, thank you. So the reason we're focusing on this right now is that in the second hour of our workshop here, we are going to use Mural as the way to record some of the thoughts that you all share in your small group discussions. So I wanted to give everyone a chance to navigate over there first and just see what it's like to try to create a sticky note and do some typing in there. And of course, if you are joining us by phone, you should be able to access the mural as well. If anyone needs help finding the mural, if you're sitting on the phone not knowing how to find that link, please speak up and we will get it out to you via email if we need to. And Brian, thank you again. To hide other people's cursors in Mural, hover your mouse over the animal on the far left of the row at the bottom, and a menu will pop up there and you can click on hide cursors. So if you're overwhelmed with 80 cursors, that will be helpful. And yes, thank you, Brian. If your sticky does suddenly disappear, it's probably because he is moving it into our welcome area in the upper left of the screen, because we will be using the rest of the mural later. Okay. So at this point in time, we are at 3:15 p.m. Eastern, 2:15 Central. Which means it is time for us to start our first presentation. So what I'm going to do is ask you to come back into the Zoom screen, and I want to share my PowerPoint slides so that we can see the first presentation. So our first speaker is Nancy Balcom. And Nancy, I've just lost your title. You are the Associate Director and Extension Program Leader for Connecticut Sea Grant. Nancy offers seafood safety training courses for processors and contributes to ongoing initiatives in shellfish, seaweed culture, storm risk communication, and marine spatial planning. Nancy, whenever you are ready, you can take it away.
Very good. Thank you, Gina. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. And what I want to do is spend a few minutes teeing up some reasons or things that I've heard over the years, and we all have, about why there's a need for some consistent guidance for US domestic seafood. So can I have the next slide, please? So I'm taking this from perspectives of different groups. I'm going to start with the regulators. When, and thinking of just Connecticut a number of years back when all of a sudden our state Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Aquaculture was faced with regulating a new farmed crop, seaweed, kelp grown on long lines. There were a lot of questions that were raised, and they have been raised by other regulators as well in other states. First of all, with a product that maybe you have no familiarity with, no background with, how do you protect public health? How do you know that when you say, yes, you can harvest it and send it into the market, that it's safe for human consumption? And so along those lines, the kinds of things you need to know are what are the potential hazards, food safety hazards associated with fresh seaweed and other seaweed products, and what might be the appropriate controls for the hazards. Another question is, what is the unit of sale for fresh seaweed? How do people go about selling it? And then if a regulatory authority
Let's give Nancy's internet just a second to catch up. Okay, chances are Nancy's dialing back in. Let's give her just a second.
Can you hear me now?
We can. I'm going to go ahead and stop your video because sometimes that can get in the way of your bandwidth. So we'll just go ahead and hear your voice.
We just started getting wicked thunderstorms, so I'm sure it started to, I apologize for that. So we can go on to the next slide. So from the industry perspective, questions that are, okay, so I'm growing this long line of kelp. How do I harvest it and handle it? Can I just cut it off the line and put it in bags? Do I need to put it on a cooler on the boat? What do I do? Can I then take my dry kelp? Can I lay it out in a greenhouse, dry it, package it up and sell it? How long is shelf life for these various forms of seaweed? Do I need to refrigerate fresh seaweed? What temperature? For how long will it last? Can I sell it at a farmer's market? Can I sell it by the pound, by the single blade? Can I bag it and seal it? If I want to freeze it, how long can it hold up? And how do I prepare it for freezing? Do I rinse it? Do I clean it? What would affect shelf life and quality if I do these things? Questions always come up about value-added products. And then what are the hazards I need to be concerned about, and what control measures can I use? And then finally, who's regulating seaweed as a food product? And will I have to undergo any inspections? And if so, by whom? Next slide, please. From the consumer standpoint, and that could include restaurants and markets and things, so you have two sort of sides to this. There may be consumers who are familiar with seaweed from imported product, and there may be consumers that have never tried seaweed at all but are now interested in a domestic product. So their questions are, how do I know that it's safe to eat? Who's regulating these products? How do I handle and store the product? And what's its shelf life and things like that if I've never dealt with something like fresh kelp before. Next slide, please. So I'm a trainer. I've been training seafood HACCP since 1997. So these are questions that are near and dear to my heart. Particularly, how do we pull seaweed into a standard seafood HACCP training? Particularly, in Connecticut, there was, our state agencies, our Bureau of Aquaculture and Public Health wanted some kind of consistent training for handling. And so they required any seafood farmers to take seafood HACCP and then develop a seaweed HACCP plan. And so as a trainer, that's fine. I can teach people the principles of HACCP, but there's a training disconnect. Anybody who's familiar with seafood HACCP knows that there's a 2-inch or 3-inch book, the FDA guidance, the Fish and Fishery Products Hazards and Control Guidance, which covers all sorts of species and process-related hazards in the areas of biological, chemical, or physical problems that anybody can look up their seafood product and their process and have a good idea of what hazards they need to deal with. We can teach a seaweed farmer the principles, but then they have nothing to look up and look for what hazards are associated with their species and their products. And I will say, and you'll probably hear about this at the September webinar, that in Connecticut we have developed some guidance, limited guidance based on or modeled after seafood HACCP, but we know that there are a lot of still information gaps. As I think we're going to hear in the next speaker, seaweed is actually going to fall under the Food Safety Modernization Act, the Preventive Controls Rule. And in this case, what do those preventive control trainers need to know about seaweed and who's going to teach them? For example, questions have been raised, are they supposed to recommend that industry follow the guidance for lettuce for the fresh seaweed? What else do they need to know? What do they need to share with their trainees on the risks and controls and where it comes from? And so we do need more research available on the potential hazards and appropriate control measures. Because we really want to move beyond our limited ability to assist industry right now, which is, here's the limited information we have. It's probably going to change. And unfortunately, at this point in time, you need to figure out the rest on your own, which is not a very satisfactory answer to give. And finally, my last slide, please. So these are my views. My view is if there was the development of consistent or standardized regulatory guidance for the safe handling and processing of our domestic seaweed. From the regulator side, they're going to be assisted by having some consistent expectations they can place on industry. Industry can then have consistent enforcement, and we replace the current patchwork. Industry will be greatly assisted by removing a lot of uncertainty and providing them more information they can act on, which could help them avoid product loss, potential recalls, and let them regularize their production so they can go about marketing and making hopefully some money on this new industry. Trainers will be assisted because they'll have the right information that people need in order to know what hazards might be associated with their products, with their species, and the control measures, and also be able to explain the regulatory environment to industry. And consumers can be assured that their public health is being protected. So hopefully they'll throw their support to the new industry with their buying dollars, removing a lot of guesswork. And I do fear, and again, this is my view, that if we have one major food safety incident tied to seaweed, domestic seaweed, it's really going to severely harm the future prospects of the industry. So that to me is why we need some guidance. And thank you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and take your questions now. And the way to do that would be to imagine yourself in an auditorium. The speaker has just spoken, and we're going to have you queue up at a microphone with questions for you. And so the way that you're going to share your questions is through a service called Menti. Now you can do this on your phone if you like, or on any web browser, but go ahead and pull up www.menti.com and then key in the 7-digit code that you see at the top here. And what will happen is that your questions will pop up, Nancy will answer them, and then when she says, okay, next question, she'll let me know. And at the same time, Stephanie and Gina are going to let me know when we're out of time for questions. So again, you're going to want to go to menti.com, key in the 7-digit code that you see at the top of my screen right there. And as soon as you're ready, you can go ahead and type in any questions that you've got for Nancy. So in chat, Randy asks, will this 7-digit code apply throughout the rest of today's meeting for questions later? Yes, it will. Okay, Nancy, first question is to you.
So will there be consideration of the EU regulations? I would think that would make sense, but not being a regulator, I don't know, but I would think that looking to how the EU is regulating seaweed handling and processing would be a good way to inform our own decisions and discussions.
Okay.
Two different regulations. HACCP is a broad term for principles that you can apply to safely process and handle a lot of different foods. So there's HACCP training that goes for seafood. There's USDA-based HACCP training for meat and poultry. There's juice and cider that falls under HACCP. Preventive controls is not something I've trained in or been a trainer in, but I believe it's got some similar expectations, but covers a lot of, like all the other foods that are not covered by the regulations that are currently in place. I would defer this answer to this or this question to our next speaker.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. We'll go ahead and move on.
Since I think that we could not only look to Europe, but I think we should also look to what's going on in Asia, where there's been a long time domestic seaweed industry for which we get a lot of imported products. So I don't know if there's actual models, but I would imagine that there are.
Okay, thank you, Nancy.
I think we should let our next speaker speak to this. I've heard rumors that seaweed may fall under preventive controls. I don't know if it's been definitively decided, but I think that I'll defer to our FDA speaker, please.
Thanks, Nancy. And just for the participants, all of these questions, whether they're answered or not, will be saved. And so we'll have a record of these.
Okay, but I don't think that that's universally known and followed. Maybe one company that has third-party audits, but there's a lot of companies that have no such oversight.
Okay, moving on.
Again, I think that this is something that needs to be researched and brought into the discussions as we move forward.
And Brian, I think this is perfect timing. We're at 3:30. We can have this last question and then move on to the next presentation.
I think that there could be a blend, and I think maybe some of the information that is provided for seaweed HACCP, seaweed handling and processing could be modeled, because a lot of people that may be working in it are familiar with seafood HACCP. And so if there's some way to bridge it, it would be great.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So again, we'll save these questions. And Gina, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
There we go, rookie mistake. I'm sorry for that. And I'm just going to have your screen change one more time. As you can see, we are back on the PowerPoint slide share. And before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to check in with Stephanie, our host. We did want to do a recording of some of these presentations, and I don't know that we started that. So we probably want to start that right now before our friends at the FDA begin speaking. So.
No, yeah, Gina, I did. I started the recording about right as you were kind of kicking us off, so we're good.
Excellent, thank you. So our next speaker is Manny Hignut, speaking on FSMA preventive controls for human foods. He is a chemist with the Office of Food Safety at the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Manny, take it away.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you for the opportunity for allowing us to speak today. Before I begin, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce a colleague and special guest. Jenny Scott is a senior advisor in the Office of Food Safety with the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, where she leads the FDA teams on the preventive controls for human food rule and guidance. Jenny has extensive experience and knowledge of the preventive controls rule and will be an excellent resource. And I'm going to lean on her to do the heavy lifting during the question and answer periods. And of course, she is a resource within the center, certainly once online questions are given. So next slide, please. Before we delve into the specifics of how seaweed will be regulated or how it is regulated, I'd like to provide some definitions to clarify. So seaweed is often referred to by a number of synonyms. I've heard sea vegetables is a term. Sometimes the word kelp is used as a synonym for seaweed. And there are other terms that are commonly used to identify this product. But what is seaweed really? Seaweed is a large, multicellular marine algae. Seaweed is not classified as a plant. Seaweed is also not defined as produce for the purpose of regulation. And finally, seaweed is not a fish or fishery product as is defined in the seafood HACCP rule. What is seaweed with regard to the agency? Seaweed is a raw agricultural commodity. Next slide. As many of you are aware, seaweed has a multitude of uses throughout the world. We'll be focused today on the use of seaweed as a food product. However, seaweed has been made into a number of commodities, including feed, fertilizer, medicines, cosmetics, textiles, paper, biofuels, and even leather. Next slide, please. Many of you are involved in the harvesting and growing and processing of seaweed products. So let's look at what a farm definition looks like with regard to the federal regulations, 21 CFR 1.2227. A farm, as defined in the regulations, is an operation devoted to the growing of crops, the harvesting of crops, the raising of animals, including seafood, or any combination of these activities. One key point to remember is that farms are not required to register with the FDA and therefore are exempt from 21 CFR Part 117. However, farms must comply with the general requirements of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and specifically, farms may not prepare, pack, or hold food under unsanitary conditions. Next slide, please. Now, the question has been raised is under what regulatory framework does seaweed fall within? Seaweed falls within the current good manufacturing practices and preventive controls for human foods rule, identified as 21 CFR Part 117. This rule modernizes long-standing current good manufacturing practice requirements and establishes new FSMA requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at the hazard analysis and preventive control requirements for just a moment. These requirements apply to facilities that have to register with the FDA. A facility is engaged in the manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of food for consumption in the United States. As I mentioned before, farms, as defined in the rule, do not have to register. The farm definition was updated when the final rule was published. And additionally, some manufacturing processing activities do fall within the farm definition. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the specifics of what type of activities are within the farm definition and which types of activities are within the manufacturing definition. And as far as a definition here, manufacturing and processing means making food from one or more ingredients, or synthesizing, preparing, treating, modifying, or manipulating food, including food crops or ingredients. Now, examples of processes that do fall within the farm definition include, for example, drying, dehydrating raw agricultural commodities, such as seaweed, to create a distinct commodity. And we'll use the example of grapes here as, for example, an example of a process that would be falling underneath the farm definition is drying or dehydrating grapes to produce raisins. Other types of activities that fall within the farm definition include activities such as labeling, packaging, trimming, washing, or waxing. Activities that fall under the manufacturing definition, which does fall under the requirements for Part 117, include activities such as cutting, freezing, bottling, boiling, milling, mixing, pasteurizing, peeling, rendering, canning, cooking, cooling, eviscerating, extracting, and other similar activities. Now, at this point, I believe we're going to pause for questions.
Yes, and as Brian typed into the chat, those of you who still have Menti open can absolutely type in your questions as you're listening to Manny speak. And I believe Jenny is also available to come on off mute and answer questions as they are asked. But remember, Manny has some more information to present, so he will be getting into food safety plans and preventive control management as well.
Thanks, Gina. And before we get started, Manny, just two requests. First of all, if you could lean a little bit closer to your microphone, the pickup's a little bit low. And then secondly, I've had the request to actually read the question so that people on the phone understand what the questions are. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then you can answer. So let's go ahead and get started. First question, USDA NOP has not established organic standards for seafood, and therefore US does not recognize organic fish. Does anyone know if organic seaweed will be allowed in the US? Manny, in this case, I think you're anyone.
I think that would be a question better answered by the USDA speaker.
Okay. So if a farm also processes, is it a facility as well?
Now, that's a very good question, and I think that gets to the heart of what was just mentioned in the previous slide. And the basic answer is it depends on what the process is. Okay. For example, in the example I did provide, drying is one of the processes that does fall under the farm definition.
Thank you, Manny. Could you again say which activities fall under the farm versus the manufacturing definition?
If we could, I can probably return to that. I can go back to that slide again. For example, as I mentioned, the drying clearly is one of those processes that falls under the farm definition. Labeling, there's several others that do fall under that definition. And we can go back and look at that slide for specifics. There are others.
Okay, maybe we can do that when we get back to your presentation. Is there any thinking at FDA to consider macroalgae differently than microalgae for human food consumption / food safety?
Jenny, did you want to tackle that one?
Not at this time. And I want to go back to that question about a farm and a facility, because there is a category called a farm mixed type facility, which means a farm can be both a farm for certain activities and a facility for certain others. And I will just use an example that's far removed from seaweed, and that is, think of an apple farm that is also making apple pies to sell at its roadside stand. And the growing of the apples, the harvesting of the apples is all within the farm definition. And in that case, because it's covered produce, it would fall under produce safety standards. But the making of the apple pies is a manufacturing and processing activity that would require that farm to register as a facility. That's the facility part of it. And they would be subject to different requirements for the manufacturing of the apple pie. Now, those requirements would not then spill over into applying to the farm activities. So there would just be two separate sets of regulations that would apply to farm mixed type facilities.
Thank you, Jenny. And Gina noted in chat that the presentation slides will also be shared, so you'll have everything that Manny shared made available to you. When it comes to a farm or facility, what are the hazards that inspectors will look for?
Did you want to take that one as well, Jenny?
Well,
Jenny's going to do the heavy lifting on the questions and answers.
So you've asked a very interesting question. In general, we try and identify potential hazards in guidance documents. And we have done so for many foods in a draft guidance to our preventive controls rule, just as we have in our seafood hazards and controls guidance. But I think Nancy raised the point that we don't know a lot about seaweed at this point in time. It's almost like the industry has gotten ahead of the science, and we do not know what the hazards are that are associated with seaweed. We can make some educated guesses on those based on the fact, well, it's coming out of the sea, fish come out of the sea, here's some hazards associated with fish, are the same ones associated with seaweed. So we might anticipate that vibrios might be a hazard, for example. But we need some research to fill in the data gap.
Thank you, Jenny.
And just one other point there, when we go to a facility, we would be looking at certain things like good manufacturing practices and how those are applied to the facility. On a farm, if it's a seaweed farm, then it's just the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. We would be looking at their practices to make sure that they are not producing adulterated food.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go ahead and get back to Manny's presentation now. So if you're ready, go ahead and cue up the PowerPoint.
Here we go, Manny. I returned us back to the manufacturing slide, if you can see that.
And Gina, I don't think you're sharing your screen quite yet. There you go.
Thank you. There we go. But Manny, I do want to take a note of time. I know you have more slides coming than the ones you went through already. And we have about 10 minutes for your presentation right now to be able to take some more questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Gina. I appreciate that. Yes, to return to that question about what activities constitute manufacturing versus which ones fall under the farm definition, the dehydrating raw agricultural commodities, which is what we consider seaweed, is one. Labeling, packaging, treating, trimming, washing, or waxing. These are activities that do fall under the farm definition, and therefore would not make the farm either, as Jenny mentioned, a mixed facility or a facility of a manufacturing facility. Many of the others, most of them, particularly cutting and freezing, do constitute manufacturing and fall under the we would consider then a facility. So next slide, please. So let's take a little deeper look at the requirements, that the preventive control rule requirements. One of the most important requirements of the rule has to do with the requirement to prepare a food safety plan. A food safety plan includes many elements, one of which is a hazard analysis. And those of you who are familiar with for example, the seafood HACCP rule are very familiar with hazard analysis. Other elements of the food safety plan, which is a comprehensive document, again, to be prepared by the facility, includes preventive controls, another term that may sound somewhat familiar for those familiar with seafood HACCP. Procedures for monitoring the preventive controls, corrective action procedures, verification procedures, supply chain program, and a recall plan. So you can see that there are elements of, many of you are familiar with HACCP, there are elements of what you may see as HACCP, but the food safety plan encompasses essentially a broader net of requirements. Next slide, please. Let's take a closer look at hazard analysis itself. Now, a hazard identification must consider known and reasonably foreseeable physical, biological, and chemical hazards. These are hazards that could occur naturally, be unintentionally introduced as a result of the process, or be intentionally introduced for economic gains. The hazard analysis, most critically, must consider the severity of the illness and injury and the probability that the illness or injury could occur in the absence of having a preventive control in place. Next slide, please. Measures required. What is specifically a preventive control? Measures required to ensure that hazards are significantly minimized or prevented. These could include process controls, food allergen controls, sanitation controls, supply chain controls, and a recall plan. And again, you will notice that some of these terminologies are similar to seafood HACCP. However, they are in the rule distinctly identified. Next slide, please. Preventive controls include controls at critical control points, if any, and controls other than those at critical control points that are appropriate for food safety. There is tremendous flexibility with regard to how preventive controls are managed, depending on your operational specifics. Next slide, please. Preventive control management components include several elements in themselves. For example, monitoring is a management component for preventive controls, corrective actions, and verification. So let's take a look at one of those. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at verification. Verification includes validation of preventive controls. In other words, ensuring that the preventive control is effective. Verification of monitoring and corrective actions, ensuring that corrective actions are applied. Calibration of process monitoring and verification instrumentation to ensure that those devices are operational and working. Product testing could be part of verification, as could be environmental monitoring. And finally, a verification will include records review. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at supply chain program. A receiving facility must establish and implement a risk-based supply chain program for raw materials and ingredients for which a hazard has been controlled before receipt. So we'll take a look at an example from produce. Fresh cut produce processor that does not have a control for microbial pathogens. In other words, a kill step for the product being manufactured would conduct a supplier verification activity. For example, perhaps an on-site audit to verify the compliance of the supplier with produce safety standards. This is another form of control. Next slide, please. Now, what's required to prepare a food safety plan? An important requirement is that a food safety plan must be prepared by a preventive controls qualified individual. And what is that? A qualified individual who has successfully completed training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls, at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by the FDA, or is otherwise qualified through job experience to apply a food safety system. Next slide, please. There are exemptions to Part 117. For example, foods that are subject to hazard analysis and critical control regulations, for example, the seafood HACCP rule and seafood juice rule, are exempt from Part 117. Dietary supplements, alcoholic beverages, and foods subject to the low acid canned food regulations. Next slide. Additionally, what is identified as qualified facilities, in other words, facilities that have an average less than $1 million a year in sales of human food, plus the market value of human food manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale, in other words, very small businesses, are considered qualified facilities exempt from the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, but do have other modified requirements that must be complied with. Next slide. Now, we recognize that this very brief overview is not going to answer all of your questions. The agency has prepared and created the FSMA Technical Assistance Network as an online tool to allow you to ask specific detailed questions. Those questions are routed to an appropriate subject matter expert within CFSAN who will be able to answer your questions. And I would encourage you to do that. And the link is provided inside of the presentation, and we can provide it elsewhere, of course. So that concludes my presentation, and certainly Jenny and I can answer some brief questions.
Thank you, Manny. Did I hear correctly? Seaweed is not considered a produce?
That is correct. Seaweed is not considered or identified as produce and is not subject to what is called the produce rule.
Is it foreseeable that seaweed could ultimately be subject to FDA policy governing interstate movement, CF shellfish sanitation?
So let me
go ahead, Jen. Yes.
Because seaweed is likely subject to the preventive controls rule, that applies to all foods regardless of whether it's in interstate or intrastate commerce. So I think that is a moot point.
Okay. Will FDA be updating the seafood list to include terms for edible seaweeds?
I would say no, because it's not considered seafood. Our seafood, we refer to it as seafood HACCP, but it is the fish and fishery products HACCP requirements, and we do not consider seaweed to be fish.
Okay. Can or have other countries that have been producing seaweed as food been looked at as models to answer some of the questions raised here?
Yes, absolutely.
It sounds like FDA has determined that seaweed is a raw agricultural product. However, once it is processed, the processing will fall under preventative controls.
That is correct, unless there is an exemption that applies, such as it's being done by a very small business.
Thank you, Jenny. Does the qualified facility definition also apply to a farm?
There is a different definition for a qualified farm, but there is a similar concept that applies.
Okay. You gave raisins as an example of a food product that can be dried on farm. Would it follow then that raw uncut seaweed could be dried on a farm without FDA oversight?
So the drying of seafood is within a farm definition, and so it can be done on a farm. I would say that it would not be something that we would have on our inspection list to show up, but it is subject to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and so if there's a problem with seaweed, then somebody gets sick, we'll be on that farm lickety-split.
Thank you, Jenny. Do I understand that seaweed is not yet included in the FDA's guidance regarding hazards that, if not controlled, may occur?
That is correct.
Okay. Have countries such as Japan or South Korea developed guidance for control of hazards?
I don't know the answer to that, but I intend to contact my friends in Japan and ask that question.
Okay. And that's it. We are at the end of questions.
Great, this is perfect timing. We are on schedule for a brief break to rest your eyes from the screen. And I am going to go ahead and do a screen share of a 5-minute timer. You can feel free to turn your video off, and you'll see this timer on the screen as you go about your break, and come back and join us at 4:05 p.m. Eastern, 3:05 Central. All right, it is actually 4:04 Eastern Time, 3:04 Central, so we will give folks just one more minute to come back to joining us here. Brian, Stephanie, are you currently seeing the slide that says our third presentation? Excellent, thank you. All right, I have 4:05 p.m. Eastern, 3:05 Central. I'd like to welcome people back. I hope everyone is back in front of their Zoom screens or looking at their presentation slides. If you're joining us by phone, thank you to Manny and Jenny from FDA for the previous presentation. Our next presenter is Kathy Janessi, who is a staff attorney with the National Sea Grant Law Center at the University of Mississippi School of Law. And you can take it away, Kathy.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to take a few minutes today to just do a broad overview of the, several actions that the USDA has taken to regulate seaweed. But just at the top of the presentation, I want to note that none of these regulations apply to seaweed in its whole form as a food source. So that's definitely a regulatory gap that states need to step into at this point in time. So we can go to the next slide, Gina. So the first way that USDA does regulate seaweed to an extent is through the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which has a broad mission to protect and promote U.S. agricultural health. And they regulate aquatic plants under the Plant Protection Act, which does not distinguish aquatic plants from terrestrial plants. And APHIS recently expanded the scope of plants for planting regulations to include non-vascular plants, which is defined to include green algae, as well as mosses and liverworts. So when imported for growing or propagation, aquatic plants require a phytosanitary certificate issued by the exporting country and a written import permit for the shipment of 13 or more articles. Like all plants intended for planting, aquatic plants are subject to inspection at the port of entry and must be free of quarantine pests. Next slide. So, identified federal noxious weeds can be imported or moved interstate only with what is called a PPQ 526 permit, which allows one to move live plant pests and noxious weeds. At the present time, APHIS regulates only one algae under these provisions. And so it's the Mediterranean strain of Caulerpa taxifolia, and I'm sure I murdered how to say that. I'm a lawyer, not a scientist. But it's also known as killer algae. And so this is a strain of green marine microalgae that can be highly invasive and is widely used as a decorative plant in aquariums. And so it is actually native to tropical waters in the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans. Then in the 1980s, a specifically bred cold-resistant clone of this strain was introduced by accident in the Mediterranean Sea from a public aquarium in Monaco. And from there, it spread around the Mediterranean Sea. And at this time, it's also been found in California and Southern Australia. And so it's actually known as the aquarium strain of this algae. And it can be really harmful to environments and spread really quickly. So since this one strain is listed as a federal noxious weed, it needs this 526 permit to be imported or to move interstate. But that is the only algae currently that is regulated under the federal noxious weed provisions. Okay, next slide. And so the other way that the USDA has taken action related to seaweeds is the USDA Organic Program. And so that is administered by the Agricultural Marketing Service, or AMS, which administers programs that create domestic and international marketing opportunities for U.S. producers of food, fiber, and specialty crops, and ensures the quality and availability of wholesome food for consumers across the country. Established by Congress, the National Organic Program develops and enforces uniform national standards for organically produced agricultural products that are sold in the United States. And so the National Organic Program operates as a public-private partnership, and it accredits third-party organizations to certify that farms and businesses meet the national organic standards. The USDA and accredited certifiers also work together to enforce the standards that protect consumer confidence in the integrity of the USDA organic seal. So next slide. So currently the USDA regulates the classification of farm kelp and other algae as organic, but again, not when for sale in its whole form. And so the only way that it is allowed currently is as an ingredient in livestock, feed, fertilizer, or food for human consumption. So the regulations allow for non-organic substances taken from certain farmed marine plants and algae to be allowed in products labeled as organic when the algal product is not otherwise commercially available in organic form. So the allowable species include kelp, to be used only as a thickener or dietary supplement, as well as specific kombu and wakame seaweed. Secondly, the regulations allow farmed aquatic plant extracts to be used in organic crop production as a plant or soil amendment in certain circumstances. So next slide. And so the National Organic Program has produced at least one rule and guidance document that's applicable to seaweed. And so NOP 5027 provides for the use of kelp in organic livestock feed and establishes that kelp must be certified organic if it is going to be used as an ingredient in such. And the only way that that certification can happen is through the USDA wild harvest provisions. So just to highlight that point, you can't grow kelp right now and use it for this purpose. The regulation, the NOP 5027 says the harvest has to be from a designated area that has had no prohibited substances applied for a period of 3 years immediately preceding the harvest. The prohibited substances consist of 7 listed categories, including such things as ionizing radiation and sewage sludge. And the marine algae also has to be harvested in a manner that ensures such harvesting or gathering will not be destructive to the environment and will sustain the growth and production of the wild crop. Okay, and then next slide, Gina. So I just wanted to highlight here our seaweed website page that we have for this project, just because it has a couple of other documents that touch on in a little more detail some of the topics that we're covering today in this webinar. And to just follow up to that comment that we had with the earlier presentation, there is, no organic standards for commercial aquaculture at this time. We've been waiting for that for a while. And I can't speak to whether or not it's going to include seaweed or not. But I'm happy to take questions. And we also have Cared from USDA on with us as well today. So like Manny did, I might be deferring to him to answer some of the questions that come up in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you for that, Kathy. So these questions were coming in during the break. So to your point, who might be the best person to answer this one? Seeking clarification, if seaweed is considered a raw agricultural commodity, do seaweed farmers still need to complete an HACCP, HACCP, I think, plan, as is currently required in some US states?
Well, this is Jenny. I'll start with that. With respect to FDA regulations, the farming aspect does not require a HACCP plan, and whether or not one is required would then depend upon certain state regulations. If they require it and you are producing in that state, then you would have to have a HACCP plan.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll follow up to answer that just quickly, as that question kind of touches on the whole reason for this project that we're working on, because states are requiring different things and there's nothing currently required on the federal level. So that is kind of why we're kind of looking at these different issues to work on to kind of get to a regulatory model through this project.
Thank you, Kathy and Jenny. Are there any hazards associated with seaweed farmed and or wild harvested and sold as human food?
Yeah, this is Stephanie. I don't know if Nancy might be the best to answer it, but yeah, the short answer is yes. Depending on the growing waters in the geographic area, there may be hazards associated with seaweed.
Yeah, and I think as Nancy commented on earlier, that there may be the issue that the industry got a little ahead of what we know the hazards are at this point in time.
Yeah, in Connecticut, we've had some research projects which have looked at, some potential hazards, and we did develop some guidance. So I think Jenny earlier said something about Vibrios, which could possibly be a concern. So we've looked at a few things, but we feel like there's still a lot of gaps. But that guidance, I suspect it'll be discussed at the September webinar in more detail and can be shared.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and Nancy, just to follow up on Nancy, on Connecticut's program will be one of the ones featured in September.
Okay, looks like APHIS, expanded definition of plants to include non-vascular plants, including green algae. What about brown and red algae?
They're not included in the definition.
Okay. Particularly regarding the organic certification, how does USDA interact with states to determine whether harvest of seaweed would harm the environment?
Gary, do you have anything to answer to that?
Sorry, yeah, that I don't have the answer for that one.
Yeah.
We can reach out to folks at AMS though to see what they say.
Okay. Confused. Use of farm seaweed in livestock feed is not prohibited, correct? Cannot be designated as organic livestock feed, question mark?
So what I discussed was only to be certified as organic under USDA regulation. And so there are provisions that allow it to be used, but they have to follow the regulatory process for going through that to be able to be put into an organic livestock feed. So it can only be used as an additive, only certain species can be used.
Okay, thank you. It looks like Adam Orr also adds in the chat, only select seaweeds are permitted for use as livestock feed. How can organic certification even be considered? There is no way to control what kind of water the crop is contacting, and coastal waters are incredibly likely to contain waste and fertilizer runoff. Kathy?
Yeah, I defer to the USDA on that one.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. These are all things that are considered when, you know, they design organic programs. And so these are the things that would have to be worked out. You know, there was mention that, you know, this is a public-private partnership to develop organic standards. And so there has to be a lot of input and consideration of all the factors in the process.
Okay. Thank you, Caird. One comment showed up in chat from Luisa Castro. In 2016, at least 14 people were sickened with salmonella linked to farm seaweed from Hawaii Marine Agri-Future LLC of Kahuku, Hawaii, is recalling its Kahuku Ogo, Robusto Ogo, and Kahuku Sea Asparagus, which were distributed mainly in Hawaii to seafood and produce distributors through direct delivery, but also to some customers in California, Washington, Nevada, and Tokyo, Japan, and retailed at local farmer markets in Hawaii. Thank you for that, Louisa. Okay, that is the end of our questions. Gina, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you whenever you're ready.
Thank you. We are going to come back into the PowerPoint for a moment here to set up and talk about how the small group discussions are going to go. So again, if you think about being in a room together, this is the point at which you've heard from some presenters, they've shared the knowledge that we have about federal regulations. And now I might say, okay, so at your tables, you all have some flip chart paper, have a discussion about what the gaps are and how states can create their own regulations to fill those gaps, and use that flip chart paper to go ahead and capture your knowledge, and we'll collect it all together at the end. Of course, online, it's a little bit different, right? So the purpose is the same. We want to gather the knowledge in this Zoom room, gather the knowledge in this meeting. So what will happen is we're going to use Zoom's breakout room feature to separate people into groups of about 4 or 5 and invite you to come off of mute inside of those rooms, introduce yourselves to each other just as you would if you were sitting around a table together. and pick one person who will be the scribe and actually take some notes in our shared mural whiteboard document to capture what your group is discussing. And at that point, you're basically just going to consider these questions of what are the gaps that exist in the federal regulations as you've learned about them today, and consider how these gaps maybe create some opportunities for states to create regulations that fit each state's own unique needs, or certainly at least how the state might fill those gaps. Now you might have people from different states in your breakout group, and that's perfectly fine. You can simply talk about the situations that you experience. You will see these questions in writing in the mural, as well as on the screen in a moment, so don't worry about writing them down right now. Here they are on your screen in front of you. What are the gaps in federal regulations that you learned about today? And how can states fill in what's missing from the federal framework? So at this point in time, I'm going to continue sharing, but attempt to switch my screen, if I may, to show you how this will look in Mural. And it looks like I'm having just a bit of trouble doing that. So I'm going to stop my share for a moment and come back to share again in just a moment. So here we go. This is what the mural is. Now I'm sharing it here so you can stay in the Zoom room, but I will go ahead and invite people to follow me within Mural, and I will stop sharing after I demonstrate how it works within the mural. So there's a section in the mural where it simply says it's time for small group discussions. And if you have trouble finding that, you can either use the navigation map at the bottom, or in outline, you can click on breakout group instructions and you will go directly there. Now it reviews exactly what the instructions are that I just spoke about. Your breakout group number, you'll see in Zoom when you go into the breakout room. The top of your Zoom screen, it will tell you you are now in breakout room number 1, 2, XYZ. And you'll come off of mute in Zoom to introduce yourself to your group members. And at least one person in that group, or all of you, can come over into this mural. And you will navigate to your particular spot. What do I mean by that? How can you find it? You simply move straight down. Thank you for your time and your energy in that, in those small group discussions. I hope everyone had good discussions. Looking at that mural, it looks like we have a lot of really good information and ideas in there. We have too many people on the line today, even now that we are at our lower number, 55 people instead of 83, to go around and have every group report back verbally. However, we do want to navigate into Menti one more time. And ask everyone to be able to give us just your one top takeaway from your small group discussion. So if you just navigate back to Menti and use that same code one more time, assuming you have to re-enter it, 4816394. It's at the top of the screen here that's being shared from Brian. And you can type in just one thing that strikes you as important that stands out to you from your small group discussions today. So it looks like people who maybe were in different situations or different states or agencies had similar questions and concerns regarding some of the gaps. Federal seaweed regulations should mirror the NSSP and ISSC model for national standards. There's a significant need for FDA to invest in research. There are a lot of gaps and questions about this emerging product. A question about, can we have FDA and USDA coordinate to provide clear guidance? There are lots of comments coming up here. Stephanie, would you like to leave these on the screen as you talk through some of our next steps? I know the National Sea Grant Law Center and Sea Grant system across the states is working a lot on research as well as scientific research as well as legal research.
Great. Yeah, you can let them continue to scroll. And yeah, so some of you may have participated in a workshop in March in Rhode Island. So Connecticut Sea Grant is leading a partnership of many Sea Grant programs around the country to facilitate what we're calling the Seaweed Hub. And we had a great meeting at the beginning of March that involves a lot of working groups around a lot of variety of issues related to seaweed. And so the National Sea Grant Law Center is a part of that. And this project is running parallel to that one, and both projects will be informing each other. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, our next steps are we will have 2 more webinars in this webinar series. The next in September will focus on state programs, so sharing information about what state agencies across the country have been doing so far with respect to their seaweed industry. And then we'll have a webinar in October where the industry members and others will have a chance to kind of share some of their experiences in this emerging industry. And then we're going to take all of the information that we gather this summer and work towards a virtual workshop in late January that will be for state agency managers to talk about what their programs and are there ways to collaborate and kind of have some more harmonization across state programs and with the federal programs at FDA and USDA. And so we have a lot we'll do, and we have a lot of research plan, legal research and policy research plan that will be coming out of that. And so, yeah, we think that it's been great kickoff today. We love the interaction that everybody's had. We will post a recording of the formal presentation part of the webinar on our website, as well as the slides from today. And we will also be compiling the questions that were asked during the webinar and working with our speakers and others to get answers to those, and we will post those as well. And with that,
Thank
Gina,
you, Steph.
yeah, and as people drop off, we do have an evaluation survey. Gina's going to put that in the chat box, so please click on that and fill that out.
Stephanie, we do have just a few more minutes, and it looks like just 18 people or so have shared their takeaways. So please go ahead and share your takeaways here. We're seeing a lot of good comments, and I think maybe the same small group is sharing a few thoughts, which is lovely, but we'd love to hear from more of our 51 participants right now. And we did have a question, actually, Stephanie, in the chat. Will the current project for the National Sea Grant Law Center include a summary of the known hazards?
So we have talked about that amongst our team. We have done some preliminary research looking at journal articles that have been published, but as Kathy mentioned earlier, so everyone at the National Sea Grant Law Center is an attorney, and we are not scientists that are experienced with reading journal articles and things like that. And so we don't have the expertise to do hazard analysis, for instance, but we are hoping to produce a document that might outline what is currently known from the literature about the hazards and from experiences of state agencies, such as the one that was shared in Hawaii and other places, to provide some context.
Thank you. And Manny, we have a question from Kimberly asking if FDA is developing or planning to release any seaweed specific guidance.
Our long-term goal is to develop guidance. So I think it's not something that will happen immediately, but part of our participation in this forum is to help gain input and ultimately use that as a way to partially inform that guidance. So the answer is yes.
Thank you, Manny. And I noticed one of our responses in the Menti scroll is more time, as everyone has more to say. So I don't know if that was referencing the earlier presentations or for the small group discussions, but thank you for noting that. We will certainly consider timing as we move forward as well. One more comment from the chat from Meg. Please include tribal fisheries and aquaculture managers to the upcoming state level discussions. Tribal communities' food safety considerations can be different from non-tribal based on seaweed consumption patterns.
Yes, Meg, thank you for that comment. We do intend to include tribal managers in the state workshop. I know we often refer to state program managers, but we do consider tribal managers to be of equal importance. And we'll work harder to reference that in future webinars, but they are intended to participate.
Thank you. So at this time, and again, we can leave the Menti screen open for another 3 or 4 minutes here, but I want to go ahead and share the evaluation link that Stephanie referenced earlier. We do want to know how you felt about today's session, particularly the use of technology and the different software systems that we chose to use today to find out if it was a good or a bad experience. So we do hope some of you will participate in the upcoming events. For example, the date of September 23rd is the next workshop that Stephanie mentioned, focused on state regulations and including tribal communities as well. There will be an opportunity for those of you who complete that evaluation survey to actually input your email address to make sure that you can get that invitation to the September 23rd webinar. And I'd like to thank everyone, most especially Nancy Balcom, Manny Hegnut, Jenny Scott, and Catherine Janessi for your presentations. Thank you to Stephanie, our host, and to our technical hosts, Brian, thank you very much, and Zach, thank you for helping folks out today. Thank you to everyone for whom Mural was new. I don't know if that's actually everyone on the call or not, but it's always a little bit of a challenge to suddenly start to use something new in a group of people that you haven't met before. So I appreciate everyone diving into the Mural there. So thank you for your energy and your participation. And that is the end of our formal webinar today. Thank you for your time.
Right. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. Thanks.